Well, I think that the whole of John's Gospel, we sometimes misrepresent those first 5 or 6 chapters. I mean, what is happening is, in fact, is that the opposites in John's Gospel are being shed or exposed to us. And so the wedding in Cana of Galilee, which we think is a fine and beautiful thing, the making of water into wine, is actually an act of defiance, because a wedding is about promise and the future. And whenever a wedding happens in Eastern society or in the Middle East, and why those places are bombed, is in fact because they are acts of defiance against all that smells of death in a society. In the case of the woman of Samaria, of course, one of the questions you ask is, I mean, how on earth did Jesus move into this area, which is in some ways a territory that people have always considered unclean? But he breaks the boundary, and he goes there with his disciples, probably kicking and screaming. And the one thing that they won't do there, of course, is to eat the food that is offered in the local shops and marketplaces. And so they go off to go and buy food, presumably from a pure area, to bring to him. And in that hiatus, Jesus sits at the well, and God forbid, a woman from Samaria shows up. And Jesus is thirsty, and he asks her for a drink of water. And then you find this remarkable dialogue and this engagement with this woman, which talks about the living waters. And then, of course, it finishes with Jesus saying to her, yes, there is a deeper water that you are running away from. Go and call your husband. And immediately she is taken aback, because that which is her deepest wounding comes to the forefront. Here's a woman who has had 5 husbands before her. And of course, Western theology almost suggests that somehow she's a prostitute, when in fact, or a loose living woman, when in fact it could well mean, and is more likely to mean, that she had had husbands from one brother to another, one relative to another who had died. And here she is in a place that is considered, and her whole personality is now considered to be totally and utterly rejected, because to touch her is to touch death. And yet, there's one person, she says, who is prepared to protect her. And Jesus identifies that person and says, go and call him. And she runs back, and instead of calling him, she says to the whole community, you know what? I have met someone who has told me exactly what I am. And something has happened to this woman, obviously. Could he be the Messiah? Could he be the one who is going to expose all of us in such a way that reconciliation and healing can be made possible? And they come to Jesus, and they say to Jesus, they test him, come and stay with us. By this time, the disciples have showed up. They're pretty upset that he's been talking to this woman. They're wondering whether he has eaten something, because he says, my food is to do the will of my Father in heaven. You can imagine all their sensitivities now being totally and utterly, concerned. And then he decides to stay with them, stay in this Samaritan village. A Jew staying in a Samaritan village, eating, drinking, sleeping, doing all those things that Jews were not permitted to do. And in that moment, he breaks everything down. And the Samaritans say to him, it is no longer because the woman told us that she was exposed to a love and a healing beyond all measure, but you, in your staying with us, have shown us this, have depicted this love to us. You've broken down the barriers, you've broken down the boundaries. And Jesus then responds by saying, the fields are full, waiting to be harvested, because the boundary had been crossed, and crossed by an act of costly engagement and encounter.